But I first got involved with history through this gentleman. Sorry, that's the 4 books. The gentleman is someone some of you will recognise, Cyril Mummery. Whatever I know about history all started with him. He was wonderful. It was definitely my best subject. And if I hadn't done history, I don't think I'd be here now. Just to explain a little bit about me, there are 4 members of Old Scholars of my relationships. One of them online from Canada, and my wife and my daughter here, as well as me. There are 2 others. One's on honeymoon and the other one's somewhere else. I've been associated with the school for 79 years. It's rather shattering. I was a pupil between 1944 and 52. That's 9 years. And I became an Old Scholar when I left in 1953, and I'm still a member. I married an Old Scholar who was called Pilly in those days. And thank goodness I did, because we're both still going very strong. I became a parent when Sarah came. I became a grandparent. And then I was asked to join the governors in 2000 and eventually became clerk. And I was there for 11 years altogether. I helped to develop the new junior school, which we opened in 2012. And that's really when my main action with the school finished, because by 2017 they had managed to spend the £4 million I left with them, as well as everything else. Now, the Friends School, Quaker schools, all began way back. The first Quaker school were Waltham and Shackwell in 1670. Now, I'm not going to go through all this list because it's going to take too long, but we need to know, why was there a Quaker school in Saffron Walden? So, the 4-site Saga. The Friends School, Saffron Walden, really began in 1702 in what was a workhouse and in Clerkenwell in North London. By 1786, they'd run out of space and they moved to Islington, and the Clerkenwell site remained as an old people's community. From 1825, they moved to Croydon because with the growth of London, the health was not good. And surprise, surprise, by 1879, they had to move to Saffron Walden because the same thing had happened. So, very briefly, the Clerkenwell plan, 27th of July, 1702 was when the school started. And the workhouse cost £1,923. There was a committee of the London Middlesex General Meeting who founded it. Then they moved to Islington, rather a nice shot of the buildings there. And I'm skipping this quickly because of the time. On to Croydon. Quite a lot of development in Croydon because of education. Former pupils became apprentices and then teachers. And it was very much, I think, the real development of the school. One interesting thing, in 1825, the first 2 superintendents were Mr. and Mrs. Diamond, and they'd been students at Sidcutt. And when they wanted to go on teaching, the committee said they couldn't have a husband and wife together in a school, so they moved to Croydon instead. This is a shot of the school in Croydon. We believe it's around 1879, but we don't really know. And that's the last of the school just before it moved to Walden. So really back to Saffron Walden now, and that's what you're really interested in. So the school on the hill, and the building is as you see it, as it was first built. So it doesn't include the master's block on the left or anything on the right. And it was a greenfield site. On the left there, you'll notice That's where the sports hall now is, with the pool behind it. And it literally was a field. And in the far distance, you can barely see it, on the right-hand side is what was then called Flint House, owned and occupied by Mary Gibson, and eventually became what we now know as Croydon House. This is a view from the rear. Possibly some, or maybe even all, of the 58 boys that opened it up. This area is where the biology and science labs eventually became. The two hard tennis courts are in 1952. After I completed my GCE exams, we were rolling the ground for the building of those new tennis courts. And behind the photographer, of course, is where we built the new junior school. This is looking to the north. Just shows how the town has developed since 1879. On the far left is buildings that eventually became the Royal District Council offices, and a row of cottages which are opposite the railway, and then two houses in West Road. Interesting date on here, called Friends College in 1880. That's a year after it opened. Didn't seem to last very long, and that seems to be the whole of the school. I haven't counted them all, but there should be 32 girls and 58 boys, and it's where we all remember the girls' playground. 1902, opening of the swimming pool. First swimming pool in East Anglia, I think. The town didn't manage to get around to building their pool until 1910. And that's the interior when it was opened. Hasn't changed much. We did put a new roof on it in 2002, but it's also, of course, the gym was built, and there's one of the first classes, 1905. I've made 16 girls in that class, and it still looked very much like that when Margaret and I were there. 1905, staff. I want to particularly point out the Brightman Roundtree, who is on the right. No, I can't show you, can I? On the right-hand side, in the middle, is the right-hand male, and we'll come back to him in a minute or two. All these photographs all came out of the archives, so they're either sitting in Martin's garage or they're in the Essex Record Office. I found this quite fascinating because there's quite a variety of bicycles here. From the second on the left, there appears to be what looks like a reasonably modern bicycle, but also a couple of what appear to be two-wheel bicycles, but whatever they were, I don't know. And this was the original dining room. At the rear, you'll notice the gallery. It was eventually filled in and turned into offices. And Eric Brown, some of you may remember Eric Brown, who was the first bursar of the school after the war. He told me that the gallery was erected so it provided access for boys to the bathrooms on the girls' side. So I think by the time, Andrew, you were there, they'd actually put some bathrooms in for you.
As far as I remember.
Martin was talking about the avenue. Here's an early photograph of the avenue. And we've already heard about the kicking the stone. We did try and make sure we kept that stone when we built the new junior school. It was certainly by the back gates when that was opened in 2012. Chemistry lab, only some of you may remember that. It was upstairs on the first floor off the end of the boys' playroom. 1905, the school gong. It was made by an old scholar, and it was presented at the Whitsun weekend in June the 12th, 1905. Later on, they converted it so that it would actually be freestanding, and when we did get access to some of the archives when the school was closed, we did present that to the museum, who got it safely stored away in the Shy Hill store. So it is still in the town and can still be inspected if you ask the curator. Some of you may remember this, built in 1911 as the sanatorium. Prior to that, in 1903, the master's block was built, and 1910 was the beginning of co-education. When the school first opened, apparently boys were all taught in one end and girls in the other. It eventually became a boarding house for junior boys, and then, of course, was part of the junior school. 1912 was the first matric class, and the first scholar passed London Matric the year after. 1914, no photographs I'm afraid, but 1914, the school was actually requisitioned by the army, and they had it back a year later. 1918, some of you might remember that, used to be in the library in the school, and I believe it's now been saved and passed to the Skelton family, two of whose members are on there. 1921, it's a photograph of where we are today, the meeting house. It was also built in 1979 by George Stacey Gibson, and these are some of the boarders attending meeting in 1921. It was also that year it was recognised by the Board of Education as an educational establishment, and some more boys' classrooms were built that year. 1930, one or two of us might remember this. This is the rear of Junior House and shows the school buildings that were erected in 1930 when Flint House was turned into the junior school. And in 1936, the first children came to the school recommended by the Essex Education Committee. I think we tend to forget that state education didn't start until 1952. So in the 1930s, any education was either private or funded by local authorities out of what were then called rates. Old Scholars, a reunion in the 1930s, showing some of the attire. The lovely blazers that you can see, particularly on the right-hand side, were maroon with white stripes, rather like the tie I'm wearing. And this one apparently was a games blazer. Martin actually found it when, I can't remember how long ago, Martin, but some years, we were clearing out a cupboard upstairs, and it was rolled up in a brown paper parcel. It has been, I took it into our deep freeze and froze it to get rid of all the insects, and we had it cleaned, and it is now being passed to the Saffron Walden Museum where they're preserving it, so that again will also last. 1937 was the Assembly Hall. Couldn't find any photographs, so somebody might be able to help us with this, earlier ones. But these are the plans that I did find in the archives. And that's what it looked like just a few years ago. This was just after the school closed, I think, or about the time the school closed. Have I gone too far, hasn't it? One of the problems about history is we tend to look at buildings and forget that they were there for a purpose. Just the odd one or two I've picked out to tell you about. Stephen Walker, 1918, he was the son of the head of the school, and he went into the flying corps and was killed in a flying accident at Duxford. Stanley King-Bear was a conscientious objector in the First World War, and was put in prison, and then he was discharged because he was a vegetarian and they didn't want him to be diet of not having eaten anything whilst he was there. So he went on and became a teacher at the school, and he died in 1939 with a heart attack, and I think it was on one of the walks, school walks, which is very unfortunate. Edward Borden is quite well known locally as an artist at the school. The Fry Art Gallery here has specialised in pictures that he took. And he actually used to live in a house in Park Lane, which is still there. And Ralph Erskine, a renowned architect, was involved in the building of the Biker Estate in Newcastle. You might remember something about the biker children in the school of television some years ago. He eventually moved to Sweden, where he managed to get a Royal Gold Medal in 1987. Now, I mentioned C.B. Rowntree earlier on. He was at the school a very long time, and when he retired, he became a member of what was then the Saffron Walden Borough Council and became its town mayor. He also wrote a book, Walden Then and Now, of which I have a copy. The school only appears a little bit in it because it's mainly a history of Walden itself. And one other person I should mention is somebody I knew quite well, Henry Rowntree. He was a surveyor to the Hertford Water Company, and I knew him when he retired and moved to Devon. Moving on a bit now, 1954, the choir. The junior house school closed in 1949 as part of the coming of the state schools, and the Essex County Council agreed to send assisted places students to the school, but they had to increase the accommodation. So the governors then decided that they'd close the junior school. It became science labs to start with, and then a boarding house. But there was a gap in the junior house for quite some time. In the 1950s, the governors did actually look into whether they could become a direct grant status school, which would have meant there would have been state money in the school. They rejected it on the grounds that they couldn't maintain the Quaker ethos under that scheme, so it unfortunately didn't go ahead. And everybody, I'm sure, will remember Richard Sturge, who taught music at the school. He even taught me something, don't know what, but there you go. 1961 looks a little bit better than it did in the photograph we saw earlier. It was built in 1961. The estimated cost was £40,000. It actually only cost $35,864, so they managed that pretty well. And $25,000 of that came from the Essex County Council, which was why it was called the Essex Wing. And then development continued in, going back a bit now, 67 was when the girls' changing rooms were built on the side of the pool. I hope they're going to put better ones in than they are now. And the smaller sanatorium was built, and the junior boys went into Gibson, as I mentioned earlier. There was Crossfield was built at that time with some accommodation for staff elsewhere. At the time, the school was 390 scholars aged from 11 to 16 to 18. And as it shows on there, in 84, the sports hall was built. And they raised enough money for that to also build the music centre. So raising money was quite an achievement for the school over the years. And that's a more recent photograph of the interior. Now to the current century, 2000. It was the year I became a governor. And this photograph was taken from the school tower looking down Two of my grandchildren will be on the right-hand circle as being part of the junior school, and I think Margaret and I were in the top left-hand corner, but you can't really see us from there. Another notable old scholar, for that tercentenary, Tony Newton, who was actually called Harold when he was at school and was the year below me, but achieved quite well in government. He became a Minister of Health, and I had managed to get him to talk to the local CAB in its formation many years ago. Sadly, he died in 2012. Other notable old scholars, some of you might remember some of these. John Cadman persuaded me to wear running spikes, which made me one of the fastest boys in the school at the time. John, of course, taught in the school later and was in the hockey team that went to the Olympics in Tokyo in, if I can read it here, 1960... No, 1970, yeah. 64, that's right. And on the bottom left, Tom Robinson, I'm sure you all know him, he's still going strong, I think. So all three examples from the late 20th century. This is the final thing, isn't it? 2002 to 2012 was the building of the last buildings that the school actually achieved, nursery and junior school. It reopened in 1992 in Gibson House, and the smaller sanatorium was also used, and they put the health area in the main school building. In 2002, fairly newly appointed Andrew Walters asked the government for a development plan for the 21st century, and I became clerk of the governors around about that time. And after a long planning progress, we built this new junior school, funded by the sale of the land for the housing development, which is now known as the Avenue, and the Housing Association by the Water Tower. On the left there is when we dug the first soil. Our local MP, Alan Hazelhurst, and one of the youngest members of the school in the junior school, and somebody from the sixth form, and me on the left. Those new buildings were formally opened in September 2012. Some of you may remember David Wood. David and I formed project sponsors and sat with the development team well over a year. And we managed to bring that school into development in £20,000 under budget because we found that we could put the panels on the roof cheaper. So it's quite an achievement, because to actually build something and bring it within budget is quite an achievement. And when I left the board, they were just about to collect the balance of the money from Hill Development. Another £4 million went into the school. Quite what happened to it, I'm afraid I can't tell you, because I was no longer involved after that. I suspect it probably went on bursaries to keep children there. 2009, I think probably the only time we ever had 5 heads on the school premises all at the same time. And it's the time that Martin eventually retired. You had the whole of your teaching career, I think, at the school.
37 years.
Yeah. So 23rd of July, 2009, John Woods on the right, Sarah Evans, then me and Martin, Jane Lang, and Graham Wigley's out of order, and Andy Waters. So all 5. That was a lovely evening. So, the 4-site saga, the closure. In 2010, which was my last year on the board, we had nearly 400 pupils in the school. You'll remember, of course, there was an economic crash in 2008. When it closed, they got down to 280 pupils, and with a staff of 100, it was clearly no longer viable. Very sad, but I think it's part of history. Things come and eventually they go. There were many local families in the school, 3 generations of many of them, including my own. There were also generations of local families who worked in the school, and a lot of them lost their jobs, of course, in bedding, catering and maintenance. All of this largely has come from these 4 books. I've got 2 copies here for you to see, but they are some I intend to give to my grandchildren. There are copies of those books in the Saffron Walden or the Gibson Library. I think probably Martin might have a few been stored in his garage.
Yes.
And a set have gone to the Essex Record Office. So I think that's a very brief and rapid history of the school. There's a lot more than that. If you're really interested, do look at the books. I think they're all online, aren't they? So you can actually look them up on the website. And there's some fascinating reading, and I thoroughly recommend them. There's a lot of history of the school that perhaps we ought to be thinking about. Because of my career as a solicitor, I acted for the school for quite a long time. Not many of you know the school didn't actually own the site until 2004. It always belonged to London Middlesex General Meeting. Perhaps it's a pity they didn't keep it. We didn't. Jane Corwin, who was bursar, and I, and Paul Honeyman, we talked about earlier, he represented London Middlesex General Meeting in the early 2000s when we sorted out. We turned the school into a limited company and we updated the deeds and all sorts of things. So there's probably another bit of history that somebody ought to write, and I suppose that might well be down to me since I was involved in it. So that's it. Are there any questions on it which I'll try and answer for you if I can? But another plea, and I noticed on Facebook, a lot of people are recording the thought that there are lots of photographs and there's lots about buildings, but not about people. So I would encourage people to actually write something about their time at school, send it to Rowley or through to the site, so it can go into the archives, because the school is not the buildings, it was what we were taught in them that counted, and without any doubt it had a very strong influence on how I've maintained my life in the succeeding years. So if I've exhausted you all, we can actually close it down. Yes?
I just wanted to say, just for information really, not a question, but the grave of Stephen Walker is out there.